All right, it is one past the hour, and I see folks are filing in and using the chat feature well. So let's get going. Welcome again, everyone, to helping nonprofits get out the vote in 2024. This is a very timely webinar as we approach the election. And as I said, we're so fortunate to have a really well-rounded group of panelists who can help address this topic from their expertise and their different lenses throughout their subject matter and viewing through the state. We can take it to the next slide, please. So before we get started, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. The first thing being the chat box, which everyone is using so well. This will be a place that people can communicate with each other and with the hosts and panelists. But the Q&A box is going to be the place where we can ask questions. And we'll do our best to answer those questions throughout the presentation, but we will also have time for a question and answer session at the end of our presentation. So if your question is not answered immediately, fear not, we will be addressing those questions towards the end of the session. Also, there is a closed captioning feature. So if you click the CC button at the base of your Zoom platform, you'll be able to have closed captioning brought to us by AI Media. We're so fortunate to have them joining us today as well. You can take us on to the next slide, please. Now, just a quick plug for CalNonprofits membership. This webinar today, we're really lucky to be bringing this to the whole community for free. Many of our webinars do incur a cost. And so by joining CalNonprofits, you won't ever have to pay for any of those events. We also have a slew of member benefits that really run the gamut from insurance, business savings, and other ways to communicate and engage with the nonprofit community. So I would encourage you to have a look at those member benefits at calnonprofits.org. And right now, we're also offering a 15% discount on membership, and that can be accessed by using the code MEM24. Next slide, please. All right, on to the real meat of the matter. We've got a great group of panelists today, and I'm so excited to bring them to you. First off, we have Shirley Weber, Dr. Shirley Weber, the California Secretary of State. We also have Tiffany Gurley Carter, the Policy Counsel for the National Council of Nonprofits, Quinn Tu, the Legal Director for Boulder Advocacy and Alliance for Justice, as well as Dean Bonner, the Associate Survey Director and Research Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. We're also really fortunate to have Jeff Green, the CEO of CalNonprofits, joining us today. And I'll turn it over to Jeff to talk a little bit about CalNonprofits and how we engage with the nonprofit community.
Thank you, Robert. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm just going to make a few comments and share sort of a perspective of our role collectively with CalNonprofits in this question. And I want to start by just outlining for those of you that might be newer to the organization what it is that we actually do. So we are a tripartite advocate for the sector. We do three things. One, we work on policy and advocacy, and many folks know that, especially coming off of a very long legislative cycle these last 2 years. Some wins, some losses, much to talk about. But what we are trying to do is really build the political power of the sector. As any of you know who work in the nonprofit world, we are an immense and powerful group of folks that know our communities, that are trusted, and yet we very often don't take that power to the legislators themselves to really show what we know and make sure that public policy reflects the truth that we're aware of on the ground. So what we're trying to do is connect and build a more powerful and politically engaged nonprofit sector across the state. Now, when I say politics, I do not think it's a bad word, and we're going to talk a lot about this today. But remember, policy is absolutely on the table for all of us. We are policy experts. We know our issues, we know our craft, we know our communities, and communicating that to legislators at all levels is absolutely core to our role. And we are constantly offering resources, examples, and really encouragement for all of us to do that collectively. And that's simply based on the idea that, could you imagine what our public policy would look like if the nonprofit sector were always at the table crafting that? I think it's fair to say it would look better on just about any front. So policy and advocacy is core to what we do. We are just coming off a 7-bill package that we named the Nonprofit Equity Initiative, really focused on the way that our government at state, county, city, local district levels relates to the nonprofit sector. They lean on us heavily, and in turn, we're happy to do the work. We just need to make sure that they're the best partner that they can be. So that's a big piece of the work. Education, that's what we're doing here today. We do a lot of simply just offering resources and information to the sector, but we also translate a lot of that policy work back to what it means on the ground. So if you hear about a new HR law, if you hear about a new compliance rule, if you hear about a tax policy change, we are trying to offer and make sure that everyone has the most current information along the way. And then finally, last but not least, and in fact, really one of my favorite things that we have done just periodically, and we're just ramping up to do again, which is to take a look at the sector as a whole, do some research, take some data and really map it for folks so that we have not only the stories that we know so well, but the data to back it up when we're talking to either our colleagues and peers, our communities, or our policymakers. So that's really the core of our work. Now, with respect to today, I want to say that some of you might know there's an election coming, and we are just weeks away. I have to admit that some of us that identify as political junkies, myself included, have probably been overdoing it on the podcasts, the news, the electoral maps, what have you. But that's because we're in this moment where every vote absolutely counts. I know that is a cliche, but we have now seen in recent years as certain races have gotten tighter and tighter, whether we're talking about ballot measures or candidates, getting people to the polls to express their preferences, their views is critical. And just before we started here speaking with our panelists, we were acknowledging, sort of lamenting the fact that what passes for good voter turnout in the United States these days, really on a global scale, is pretty sad. And so anything we can do to help people feel that voting is worth their time, that they have the information, and that they are welcomed into those polling places or mail ballot or whatever other may be available to them. So we're here today to talk about the role that nonprofits play in that. And I think I want to leave you with just a few thoughts. One is that this is really the most basic of our democratic powers and our duties, in some of our opinions, mine included, to at least let it be known what our preferences might be. It doesn't mean we always have our favorite options on the ballot, but to just show up and to make sure that our preferences, our voices are counted is, in fact, collectively a huge task. Now, we live in a state where the ballot box is protected and wide open. Thanks to our state's leadership, we had tended to stretch in California to make sure that people have every opportunity to vote. And that means we're not above experimentation with early voting or mail ballots or all kinds of things about getting people to the polls. And so we want to make sure that everyone knows that they can take advantage of that right that citizens do have. We are trusted, and that's the thing that I want to always come back to. The reason nonprofits are a wonderful messenger for Get Out the Vote drives is because above all other sectors, we are the trusted folks. People know us. They believe we're here to do good in the community. They believe that we are here to help them. And so when they hear a nonprofit leader or nonprofit volunteer say, you know, elections coming up, how can we help get you there? Now, we're not weighing in on the partisan because that's not what we can do. And we're going to hear more about that. I think most folks by now know those rules of the road. But if you are all shy about that, if you have a board that is reticent to let you engage and get out the vote drives or whatever it may be, we want to make sure you have the tools to know where the rules are and where the lines are. And one of those big lines is getting people to the polls is absolutely in our right. And I would argue for many of us a responsibility. We cannot tell them how to vote when it comes to partisan races, but we certainly can make sure that they have access. So people tend to listen. We have done many campaigns over the years. Vote with Your Mission was one a few years back. And of course, those little buttons that say I work for a nonprofit and I vote. I wore one for many months, more than I would care to admit, probably. But the fact is that these are things we can all do. Now, it is late in the game, and we know that. So today we're going to talk about the rules of the road, what everyone should know, but we're also going to offer some ideas and some strategies about if you don't have time, and at this point, most of us don't have time to build an entire GOTV mechanism in our organizations, but what can we do with what we already have on hand, with the tools that we have, with the relationships that we have? So whether this is part of your core program, whether this is a very new idea for you, or whether you're somewhere in between, what we're hoping to do today is give everybody some tools and some encouragement to help our communities show up at the polls in whatever way they can. We're going to talk about elections, integrity, clear messaging, rules of the road, the laws, what they say, some ideas on how you can do this. We're going to look at the demographics of what the California electorate looks like. So I will say, by way of introduction of our first participant here, in this case by video, we have really our favorite partners in this work. So we have Alliance for Justice, who we have partnered with for many, many years as a national leader, really on helping nonprofits engage around policy, voter engagement, and knowing exactly where those lines are and what we all need to do to be more engaged politically. We have the National Council of Nonprofits, who are our peer group around the country. There are state reps in most states, most of the 50 states have a nonprofit organization, coalition, advocate like CalNonprofits, and they do a lot of great work also at the federal level on our collective behalf. We have the Public Policy Institute of California, who are really second to none when it comes to taking a look at what is happening in our state, doing some policy analysis, releasing data, taking a deep dive on some of it. And this is what we're going to see when we look at the electorate in the state of California. But to kick us off, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Shirley Weber, our Secretary of State, someone who has been very much engaged with the nonprofit sector and a big fan of making sure our sector is engaged in elections. She could not be with us in person, but she was kind enough to record this video just the other day, and she's going to kick us off. So thank you again all for being here, and I'll turn it over to our Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber.
Well, good morning to the California Association of Nonprofits. I'm Dr. Shirley Weber, California Secretary of State, and I'm truly honored to be with you this morning. It is unfortunate that I'm not able to be there in person, but I am visiting many of our registrar voter offices in Northern California, like Northern California. So it's impossible for me to be with you at this time. But I'm so pleased that you are meeting and that the focus of your meeting is about voting. And that's what we're doing from now until November 5th and probably beyond, talking about the issue of voting, the security of voting, why people should vote, and what difference it makes when all of us get a chance to express ourselves, regardless of our party or our interests, to express ourselves about what we want California to look like and what we want this nation to look like. You know, we partnered before on this issue, and I often say to so many that we are able to do a lot in the state. But the fact of the matter is that without our partners, our nonprofits, those who work with us, then it never seems to get as good a job done as we'd like to have done. We know that it is important to reach out to every Californian to make sure that they know what their rights are, they know what the issues are, they know how to vote, where to vote, all those kinds of things. And even though it doesn't change a lot from election to election, the fact of the matter is because it's not on our mind every day as it is of those of us who run elections, we sometimes forget that we're all going to get a ballot in the mail, that we have so many days to vote, that we can do voting by many ways, not only just in terms of our ballot and mailing it in, but going into the ballot boxes, going into our polling places. All those kinds of things are available. So this is a reminder of that, but also to hopefully to motivate you to come and be a part of this whole effort. So we're counting on you. There are 10,000s of you out there who are going to help us get the word out, help us make sure that California is heard and that we participate in this process. So I cannot say enough thank you to you, because I know that without you, it would be very difficult, if not impossible sometimes, to do the job that we do. But you help us and you fill in the gap. And as a result, it makes a world of difference for me, but all of Californians, and for those who work in elections. So once again, thank you so very much for your meeting this morning. I am honored that you asked me to pop in and say thank you and welcome to this meeting. And we hope to continue to push forward, and that November 5th will be a day that we can all be proud of, because we have done our civic duty. We have helped America be America, and that we know that our democracy lives and thrives because each one of us believes in it. So once again, have a wonderful meeting. Thank you so very much. I'm Dr. Shirley Weber, your California Secretary of State.
Hello, everybody. My name is Quinn Tu, and I'm Legal Director of Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy. have the pleasure of following Dr. Weber's address to you and talking to you about the rules that apply to nonprofits when you want to engage in advocacy activities during an election season. So, a little bit about Alliance for Justice. We ourselves are a C3 organization, so the rules that I'm talking about today, we also have to follow. And we work on making sure that we can help organizations in the progressive movement work towards an equitable, just, and free society. And one of the programs that AFJ has is the Boulder Advocacy Program, where we equip nonprofits with this knowledge. So we operate a free technical assistance hotline. And after today, if you have questions, you're welcome to contact us. I will share how to do that in a little bit. And if you have questions as we go through, please pop them in the chat. We will monitor them and answer them during the Q&A session of today's presentation. So just a disclaimer that this is for educational purposes only, and we are not giving you legal advice on this training. So today's agenda, we're going to start by talking about tax-exempt organizations, the different types of nonprofits that you may come across. We're going to talk about this cardinal rule that 501c3s must be nonpartisan and what does that mean. And then we'll talk about what's permissible given that we're a little bit over a month out from Election Day, and wrap up with personal advocacy and what the key takeaways are. We'll share resources with you. You'll get them as well in a follow-up email after today. So as Jeff has talked about, and as Dr. Weber also talked about, why do nonprofits engage in voter engagement? Why is it important? Nonprofit power and was a report that the Nonprofit Vote organization came up and so showed that nonprofit participation strengthens our democracy. We help increase voter turnout, and we narrow the racial, income, and age disparity with our participation, because we are encouraging our communities, oftentimes underrepresented at the polls, to come out and vote. So even this late in the election cycle, there are still things that we can do as a community to help encourage voters to turn out. And we'll talk about what that looks like. So first, I want to share how we look at the different types of tax-exempt organization and what those mean. Many of you on this call are probably 501c3 public charities like AFJ and Rock the Vote, or you're fiscally sponsored by a 501c3, in which case you also have to follow the rules applying to C3s. So to be a C3, you get some favorable tax treatments. You don't pay income tax, so you're tax exempt. And you also get tax deductible contributions, right? People who write checks to your organization can potentially write it off on their taxes. So that's tax deductible contribution. Because of that, we have a limit on how much we can lobby, and we can talk about what that means as it arises today, or know that there's a separate training that talks about that that BA offers. But what we're here really to talk about is the last box here, how nonprofit 501c3s cannot support or oppose candidates. But there's so many other things we can do as well. After that, we're going to compare this to 501c4s, which are your social welfare organization. Legal conservation voter is an example of a C4. 501c5s are your labor unions, and 501c6s are your trade associations. This grouping of nonprofits are categorized together because you can see they're treated very, very similarly under tax law. They're tax exempt, but they don't have tax deductible contributions. So that means they also don't have a lobbying limit, and they can get involved in some either candidate endorsement or opposition of candidates. And it's important for us to know this because as a C3, you may find yourself in coalitions with a C4 or a C6 or something, and knowing what they can do also helps you understand the different roles that you can play in the coalition itself. The last category of nonprofits for comparison, and just to put on your radar, is 527 political organizations. An example is Emily's List. You can see that it's also a tax exempt category, but they oftentimes only play in the electoral arena. Um, so this is just more for your information and to have on your radar. We're really going to focus today on the rules that apply to C3s because that's where the restriction is. And once you understand that restriction, then you can unlock and move on to other activities. Okay. So, most people, when they talk about nonpartisan, they mean, oh, we're not affiliated or associated with a particular political party. Well, throw that knowledge out the window or temporarily suspend that definition because the IRS's definition of nonpartisan is really just focused on 501c3s. So when you hear nonpartisan in the context of a nonprofit, you're really looking at whether or not a 501c3 is supporting or opposing somebody who's running for public office. So this sample ballot that you see here lists just a couple of different offices and people who are running for each office. As a 501c3 organization, you may not say that you support or oppose any of these people because you'd be violating the rule to remain nonpartisan. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about a nonpartisan race or if you're talking about, a race where people are just identified by name. If they are on a ballot for a public office, as a C3, you may not weigh in on whether or not they are fit for office. So here is the visual way to sort of think about the nonpartisan rule. If you think about nonpartisan activity as the things you can do to keep you on the road, the guardrails, the supporting or the opposing of candidates are there to keep you safely on the nonpartisan rules. Okay, so then you may want to ask, well, what does this mean to be nonpartisan? How do we determine this? It's really what's called a facts and circumstances analysis, and we think about it in terms of a spectrum of risks. So some questions you want to ask yourself when you're thinking about these activities are, why are you having this communication now? Who is your audience? And what is the purpose of your communication? So then you would take a look at that, and each organization will have different levels of tolerance for the risk, right? But at least you know this is slightly going to be more risky or less risky. Here is a chart of factors that the IRS has said they weigh when they're looking at this analysis of, is there a reference to candidates? Do you have something that drives this communication? Is it because the election is coming up? Or is there something else external to it, such as there's a vote pending on a matter that your nonprofit really cares about? Are you talking about a broad range of issues? Or are you weighing in on one of these wedge issues that divide candidates? Is this something that's important to your organization's mission? Do you have a history of similar advocacy in this space? Are you calling out candidates by name? These are all facts and circumstances that will either move the needle towards the less riskier side of things or the more riskier side of things. Okay. So based on just that alone, I'm going to share this with you and I invite you to think to yourself whether this is a partisan message. And feel free to put your responses in the chat if you'd like to, or share your thoughts there. We're a 501c3 organization, and let's say we're based in the Inland Empire and we're focused on housing and labor issues. And in May, we have ads in social media that we want to target to our fellow residents that supports this bill on rent control, while the state Senate is hearing on the same issue. Okay. And we have a track record of very bold advocacy on housing. Do you think that if we put out this message and we sent out these ads, we're engaging in a partisan message or a nonpartisan message? Is this risky activity for our C3 to do? I'm going to share with you my proposed answer. I think this is a fairly low risk activity because this is squarely within our mission, right? It's a bill that's talking about rent control, and we're an organization focusing on housing issues. We were in May, months away from an upcoming election. We're not doing this ad buy because there's an election coming up. We're doing it because the state Senate is hearing on this issue. They're holding a hearing about rent control. So we're responding to something that is not about the election. So this is a fairly low risk activity. Now, if I change the situation on you, and this time, instead of being an organization that's in California, we're a C3 in Miami, and we're focusing on clean water. That's our mission. And it's October of 2024. And we are still blanketing IE residents with the social media ad about this rent control bill. But there's no pending legislative vote on it. And in the California Senate race, we have a challenger that supports the bill while the opponent doesn't. Do we have a lower risk activity or a higher risk activity? Or do you have some questions that you want to ask before you can make that determination? So I would say that this is a higher risk activity, right? Some of the things that raise flags for me. Why is an organization from Miami coming into California and speaking out about rent control when their mission is focused on clean water? They don't have a history of advocacy on the issue that we're talking about. We're in October of 2024. Why are they weighing in on something when the election's right around the corner? There's no pending legislative hearing or vote on this issue. So why are they raising this issue now? There's a challenger that supports the bill and an opponent that is taking the opposite position. So is the C3 from Miami really weighing in order to put the thumb on the scale for one of the candidates in the race? Certainly looks like it from this vantage point, right? So it'd be a higher risk activity for this C3 in Miami to engage in this activity. Okay, so that's the cardinal rule. 501c3s must remain nonpartisan. In the short time that we still have, we wanted to focus your attention on a couple of things that your nonprofit can still do. So these are some permissible electoral activities for 501c3s. We're going to talk about issue advocacy and voter education, voter registration, get out the vote. Okay. So I wanted to raise this particularly with this group because issue advocacy includes lobbying, but it also includes ballot measure. And we have 10 ballot measures in California this November. So just so people are clear, 501c3 organizations can engage in ballot measure activities. It is considered to be direct lobbying because you're talking directly to the public who will be voting on the propositions. So you can tell them, just like ACLU SoCal did in this graphic, vote yes on 3, vote no on 5, whatever, right? You can tell people how to vote, and it would be considered to be direct lobbying. Now, some caveats to doing it in a nonpartisan way: do not refer to candidates or reference the election. So this graphic doesn't say anything about whether a candidate supports Proposition 5 or not, right? It's just telling the voter this is how to vote. You want to be aware of commenting on wedge issues. So wedge issue is practically any issue that's on the ballot at this point. Abortion, the environment, all of these really starkly divide the parties at this point. So if you're making some kind of comment, you want to make sure that it doesn't sound like your C3 is biased towards one particular political party or a candidate. So nonpartisan ballot measure advocacy, such as the one you see here, is permissible. And as an asterisk to this, if you get involved in ballot measure advocacy, please be aware that there may be also state campaign finance laws that you would have to be aware of. This again is to illustrate that you cannot support a candidate. So the difference between a ballot measure and a candidate: ballot measure is about a statute or a law that potentially can pass, and it's voted on by the people. A candidate or a person running for office is something that a C3 cannot either express support or opposition for. That's what it means to be nonpartisan. Okay. You can do nonpartisan voter engagement, right? By sharing information about the voting process. Here's an example of sharing information about people who are formerly incarcerated or who have some sort of a record, and letting them know that they may still be eligible to vote. It is focused on carrying out the mission of democracy and getting as many eligible voters as possible to vote, right? This graphic does not mention any candidates or political party. It just tells people what their rights are. And it's always a good idea to link to an official source like a cal.gov, because we're trying to also combat misinformation and disinformation that's out there. You can do nonpartisan GOTV, or get out the vote. That encourages all eligible voters to participate and go out and vote. It is not designed to get out only people in a certain district because they vote a certain way. Keep out any kind of documentation that you're coming into a district to do get out the vote because it's a swing district or it's a purple district, right? You want to have nonpartisan reasons for targeting, such as it's a low income, it's a low turnout population, or their populations that you serve. We'll talk about a little bit of that in a few slides from here. So get out the vote in a nonpartisan way, right? Doing voter registration, setting out a table where you just have information and anybody and everybody can come and fill out a form. That's a nonpartisan voter registration. Anybody see what the problem with this register to vote here sign is? If you didn't catch it, it's that little sticker that's added to it. If you're a C3 running a voter registration, it's a good idea to periodically check your signage to make sure that people haven't added something to it that you didn't intend to. So, yeah, you want to make sure that you keep your signage and your table in a nonpartisan way. So I alluded to earlier that you can prioritize as a C3 voter outreach by targeting your constituency, the people that live in the region that your nonprofit operates in, or that you serve or hope to serve. So you can be aspirational and think about, the people that you're not reaching. And you can target groups with historically low voter turnout. So this is an example of an effort to target poor and low wage, infrequent voters across the country. Those are all permissible, nonpartisan reasons to target either your voter registration or you get out the vote. And as a reminder, in California, we are very lucky that we can register to vote all the way up to Election Day. So you can still do voter registration and get out the vote effort at this time, and it's not too late to do so. Speaking of California, there are state regulations. We have a practical guidance that we'll share out with you that can cover who, how to register voters, who and how you get paid for that. If you want to consider offering rides to the polls, how to do that in a nonpartisan way, how to assist voters at the polls, and many more. This is a fairly user-friendly guide that will walk you through all of those things. And of course, we're always here and available to help. As a practical tip, use disclaimers if you're going to be engaging in voter education activity or voter outreach, then they don't have to be complicated. It can be as simple as saying we're a C3 and we do not support or oppose candidates or political parties. Okay. This is more of a tip for you on social media. Telling the difference between elected and official or elected and candidate accounts is really important because your C3 wants to follow the official elected account, not the candidate account. So this is an example from Adam Schiff. I know that this is his elected account or his official one because he tells me in his handle that it's Rep. Adam Schiff, right? And he tells me in his bio that he represents the 30th Congressional District. He links to his official house.gov webpage. So if you get this, you can click on the URL and you'll see if you follow the posts that it's all about what he does in his official capacity. This is his candidate account. What gave it away? Probably the text to join, right? But also his handle is different. And he tells you right up front in his bio that he's a candidate for US Senate. And the link goes to a donation page to support his campaign. So as a C3, you really don't want to be following the campaign's account because you may be accused of being partisan one way or another. We often get the question of, well, but we want to follow all the campaigns to see what they're doing. You could do that, but it is a lot less risky to follow the official account if you're trying to influence policy and work on those issues. Okay. Wrapping up with personal advocacy. This is just to remind all of us, even though we work for a 501c3 or C4 or any other nonprofit, we still have rights as individuals. So the rules that I talked about only apply to us in our C3 capacity, but in our individual capacity, we are free to engage in whatever partisan activity we would like. The key here is that it's got to be on your own free time. So don't use your organization's resources. Use disclaimers. So some disclaimers here are I am a private citizen at this event, or my organization's name is just for identification. Make sure you're very clear what hat you're wearing at the event, and so you can distinguish between yourself and as a representative of the organization. This becomes a little bit more imperative if you're in one of those leadership roles or you're highly identified in your community with your nonprofit. You do want to make sure that if you're engaging in partisan activities, that it is clear that you're doing so as an individual and not on behalf of your organization. Okay, so the key takeaways for today are going to be, yes, you can absolutely educate and mobilize voters. It is not too late to do as a C3. Take care to not support or oppose candidates when you're communicating. And oftentimes people say, oh, it's kind of a done deal on the presidential level who's going to win, or why should I care? Think about the races at the state and the local level. Those oftentimes impact directly the constituents that your nonprofit serves and who's in federal office. So if you're trying to think about ways to message your get out the vote or voter registration, emphasize the impact that local elections going to have, and keep any kind of personal advocacy separate from your organization's activities. We have resources. We'll share them with you. We have a podcast that covers some of what we talked about today in about 10 to 15-minute increments. And then we have resources on the practical guidance that I mentioned earlier, and we'll definitely share that as well. So I will wrap up by sharing with you our technical assistance hotline. As I mentioned, it is free. You can scan the QR code here. It'll take you to a form where you can fill out your questions, and one of our 9 attorneys will do our best to get back to you within 2 business days. You can also email us at advocacy@AFJ, that's short for allianceforjustice.org. Either way, we will do our best to respond and answer questions. So questions that you have today, we'll try to get to during our Q&A session. And if we don't, or if you come up with questions later, feel free to reach out to us as well. So that concludes my part of today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Quinn. Really powerful and impactful information. And like you said, we'll be sure to include all of those resources in our follow-up email. Now, I'd like to introduce Tiffany Carter, the Policy Counsel for the National Council for Nonprofits. Take it away, Tiffany.
Thanks, Robert. And thank you, Quinn. I think that was excellent information. And we're going to repeat a little bit, but that's okay, because the information is so important that I want everyone to hear it twice. So next slide. I'm Tiffany Carter, Policy Counsel at the National Council of Nonprofits. This is the network of the National Council of Nonprofits with CalNonprofits over there on the far left. We share this on every single presentation that we give, just so that you know you're not alone. What you're doing, we have state associations across the country who are also doing it. CalNonprofits is a leader in the network, and they can tie into and call upon experts across the country if you have a question for them. So definitely take advantage of this. Next slide. But I do want to also give the disclaimer that Quinn gave. I'm a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. You don't want me to be your lawyer, but we are going to be talking about a lot of legal things today, and hopefully we could break it down so that everyone understands it in a very clear and understandable format. Next slide. So why should nonprofits engage in what we're talking about today? Voter engagement. It's super, super important. Next slide, because we don't have an agenda. What Quinn was just saying is if you as a nonprofit ask someone to vote, that person is more likely to vote just because you don't have any partisan leanings. You don't have this backwards, like, oh, I want you to vote for this person, or I'm giving you a wink or a nudge. You don't have that as a nonprofit, as a 501c3, you're not allowed to. Then we see this as a protection against partisan politics. So unlike partisan campaigns who are calling people who have previously voted and are trying to get them to vote a specific way, they have this agenda. It's known, someone calling from one campaign saying, hey, you voted, or are you planning on to vote? You know that they're trying to get you to vote some way. Nonprofits take that out of the equation, and we just want your voices to be heard. And it's super, super important. I mean, that is what the Secretary of State mentioned earlier as well. Like, we're trying to make America America. And so you're doing your part. I think she said, we have helped America be America. I think that's a beautiful way to think about it. So next slide, things that you can talk about and you cannot talk about. Quinn went through all of this, so we don't need to go through it again. Next slide. But the main point is all you cannot do is participate or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to. So you just can't support or oppose a candidate. Everything else is fine, especially if you're just talking about getting people registered and getting people to the polls. Next slide. So you can't use money, you can't use your time, and you can't use your resources. So I see there's a question in the chat. I'm just going to take it right now. It's asking if you can use an email, a work email, to ask people to stuff envelopes or to do something on behalf of a campaign or in support of the person running for office. And that is what we're talking about right here, is you can't use your resources. So you can't use your work email to do it. Leave it completely out of your work time, completely off of work resources, and do it as an individual. As an individual, absolutely go for it. And a lot of people doing policy work do this kind of thing, so that's fine. Just as Quinn mentioned, use the disclaimers, don't use your own resource, the organization's resources. Next slide. So what we're talking about in my section right now is what we have put out with CalNonprofits and Nonprofit Vote. We have created a nonpartisan voter engagement guide, which is an excellent resource. It has been completely legally reviewed, and you can go to each of the sections and take care of it and know that you are using staying nonpartisan, staying within the rules. And it breaks this all down. So it breaks down what Quinn was just talking about and what I just mentioned about nonpartisanship, the rules of, what the question just was, using digital communications, acting within your own individual capacity, those types of questions, where to find your local and state election information. So the election is 32 days away, in case you didn't know. I believe in California, October 21st is the last day to register to vote. All that information is in this voter engagement guide. And so you can just, it goes right to the Secretary of State office with all of the rules and information specifically for California. That is great for you to be able to rely on. Next slide. So the next breakdown within this voter engagement guide is to make a plan. Next slide. So it gives you ideas on how to do various voter engagement activities and how to lay it out in a very clear way for your organization. And there's a huge different range, whether you're a big organization or a small organization, in and the resources that you might have at your own availability. It's more about including voter registration and get out the vote efforts within your organization and the operations that you already have, instead of seeing it as like an additional thing that might take up more time or capacity. So things that you can do: voter registration, you can put out a table, you can mobilize and work with partners, you could do phone or text banking, depending on how much capacity that you might have. We also want to encourage nonprofit workers and volunteers to be poll volunteers, give back to your community. There's a huge need within, especially local precincts, for poll volunteers right now, and you can usually just go online and sign up. And sometimes it's even a paid position that you take a day out of your year to support your local community. And then there's a breakdown on doing a lot of candidate engagements, whether that's candidate forums or questionnaires, or how to use those and remain nonpartisan while doing so. Next slide. So this is something that I think is really interesting, and Quinn and both the Secretary of State mentioned this. Next slide. There is this question on getting people to vote who don't feel empowered, or they might be disenchanted from the voting process for one reason or another. Maybe they don't think that their vote counts, or maybe they think, oh, it just takes up too much time, or it's not for me. But this voter engagement guide has the breakdown of exact scripts that you can use, and I think it's super, super useful and kind of like this golden nugget that you can use and know that you're remaining nonpartisan whenever you're doing it. As Quinn just mentioned, tie it to a local issue that really affects a person on the ground, whether it's pockets or a tree, or a local official that might not even have a partisan attachment, a mayor or an assessor or something like that. These are your opportunities to talk to voters and potential voters and explain to them why their vote really does count. One of my favorite examples is that I had a friend who was running for office. He lost his first election by 14 votes, and he won his second election by 7. So when it gets down to these really hyper local elections, it really matters each vote that is cast. And so those are your opportunities to make people feel like their votes really matter and to get to the polls. Next slide. So the last section of the voter engagement guide, next slide, breaks down the different types of nonpartisan activities that you could take up, whether it is a candidate forum or a questionnaire. And then, there was a question about emails. Once again, going back to that, you can use your organization's time and resources to get people to vote. You just can't use it to get people to vote for a specific candidate. So you can say, hey, have you registered? Are you thinking about taking time off to go to the polls? Have you come up with a voting plan? Those types of questions are totally fine, as long as you're not opposing or supporting a candidate while doing so. But candidate forums, they're happening right now. A lot of local organizations, local councils, local cities and counties are having candidate forums right now. We really encourage you to go and hear about what the candidates have to say and get to know them, and make your own educated decision on who to vote for. So that is a way to be nonpartisan, but still get people to get to the polls. Next slide. So we have a ton of additional resources, next slide, that are all included in the voter engagement guide. You will get this voter engagement guide. I believe that we have a PDF for you, and we'll send it out along with the slides from today. But in addition to that, there's a whole section at the end of the guide, including Alliance for Justice's great resources that you should definitely take advantage of and go check out, so that you feel like you're empowered and educated whenever you walk into that voting booth. Next slide. So I'm here for questions, and I think we're going to go to Q&A in a little bit, but I turn it back over to you, Robert.
Great. Thank you so much, Tiffany. I just wanted to note that I did drop in the PDF to the guide that we've been referencing, and it will also be included along with additional resources following the webinar. So thank you so much. At this point, I'd like to bring on Dean Bonner from the Public Policy Institute of California. The Institute has compiled a really wonderful resource that goes into the demographics of the voters in California. And this is particularly important as we begin to think about the types of people that we're engaging with and ways to effectively communicate and encourage their participation. So with that, I'll leave it to you, Dean.
Thank you. Next slide. Hi, so I'm going to be talking today about PPIC statewide survey data. And so I thought it would be good to give everyone here who may not be familiar with the statewide survey a little bit of background information. The mission of the survey is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions. We also look to inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. And we really look to provide a voice for all Californians in important state policy debates. As you'll see later, the people who turn out to the polls often look different than all Californians. So from our perspective, it's important that we talk to all Californians, at least to begin with. Since 1998, we've interviewed over 420,000 Californians in 200 plus general issue specific and regional surveys. Next slide. So I wanted to start off talking about kind of, where we are in terms of, voter participation and turnout and registration. And, in recent years, California has really seen increases in the registration and turnout among eligible Californians. This has occurred as there's been reforms that make it easier to register and adjust registration, as well as easier to vote. In 2018, California initiated the new motor voter program, which allowed everyone who goes to the DMV to either re-register or update their information. And we've actually seen an increase in the share of eligible Californians who are registered. And that's the first step that it takes to actually going out to vote. Additionally, for the 2020 election, the state passed legislation requiring vote-by-mail ballots be mailed to every active registered voter in the state. This has now been made permanent, and beginning next week, ballots will be mailed out to all registered voters across the state. More than 17 million ballots will be mailed out. Next slide. And looking at the thank you. And looking at the dynamics of partisan registration over time, we see that for the most part, Democrats have only varied slightly from presidential election to presidential election. All of this data is using the 60-day registered report of registration from the Secretary of State. That's the most current data that we have, so it's important to kind of compare point in time to point in time. And while Democrats have not seen really any change, we've actually seen a 13-point decline in Republican registration over the last 8 presidential elections. Additionally, there's been a 12-point increase in the share of voters who register as independent or no party preference voters. And so this last line here is where currently the registration stands today. 46% Democrat, 24.8% Republican, and 21.9% independent or non-party preference. Next slide. And when we look at the likely voters in our survey, these are folks that we deem, first and foremost, they have to be registered in our survey. They have to tell us that they're registered. And then through a process of looking at their kind of interest in politics, as well as their intention to vote, we come up with what we call likely voters. And in surveys over the past year, we found that nearly half of likely voters are Democrats, about 1 in 4 are Republicans, and about 1 in 4 are independents. And if you hearken back to the last slide, that is roughly in line with the partisan registration of California. Next slide. And given that increase in the share of Californians who are registered as no party preference or independent voters, it's important to kind of look at to see how these folks politically lean. And in our most recent fact sheet, which I would encourage everyone to look at, and I'll share more about that in a moment, we see that independents are as equally as likely to say that they lean towards the Democratic Party as they are to say that they lean towards neither party. We also see that 1 in 4 independent likely voters say they lean towards the Republican Party. It's notable that those who are less engaged in the political process, either those who are not registered or those who are registered but independent, infrequent voters, people that we don't quite view as someone who's going to show up to the polls every single time, we see that they're less likely to lean towards a major party. And so that's notable. And so, these numbers have shifted a bit over time, but it is noteworthy that 4 in 10 independents truly say that they're not leaning towards either party, and that's important. Next slide. So let's turn to some of the demographics of partisan likely voters. When we look at ideology, it's not unexpected that we see a large share of Democrats who say that they're liberal. We see a large share of Republicans who say that they're conservative. And based on what we saw the last slide, it's not really surprising that we see, half of independents considering themselves as moderate. It is noteworthy so we've been doing these fact sheets every year for probably nearly 2 decades. And if we go back to 2012, what we see is that there's been a 12 percentage point increase in the share of independents who are saying that they're moderate. And so this is noteworthy because while we have the hyper-partisanship, where Democrats are now more likely to identify or to consider themselves liberal, today we see that independents are actually going away from the 2 poles. And that's noteworthy in this hyper-partisan environment that we're living in. Next slide. And when you look at the racial ethnic breakdown of partisan likely voters, we see that the share of white voters is much higher among Republican likely voters than Democratic likely voters. It's notable that voters of color make up a majority of Democratic likely voters. And among independent likely voters, we see that half are white, and that overall they are more diverse than Republicans, although not quite as diverse as Democrats. If we go back to 2012, we say that the share of likely voters who are white overall has actually dropped 16 points, while the share of Latinos has actually increased 10 points overall. It is noteworthy that when we look just at the Republican makeup, we see that actually the share of the share of Republicans who are Latino has actually increased 14 points since 2012, while the share who are white has decreased 21 points. And so that is noteworthy. Next slide. And when we look at kind of the partisan makeup by age, we see that overall, half of likely voters are 55 and older. And when we look at the parties, it's noteworthy that 60% of Republican likely voters in our surveys over the past year are 55 and older. Nearly half of Democrat and independent likely voters are 55 and older. Democrats are slightly more likely than Republicans to be comprised of younger folks. And when we look at changes since 2012, it's notable that the share of Republican and independent likely voters who are 55 and older has actually increased by 12 points. So these groups are actually getting more old as we've over time. Next slide. So I kind of mentioned it earlier, but what we're seeing, despite some of these shifts in the makeup of the electorate, likely voters continue to look like what we've deemed the exclusive electorate. And that is that certain groups are overrepresented compared to the share of adult population. So what we see here is that, if we look at the demographics of the state, whites only make up 38% of adults, while they make up half of likely voters. Latinos make up nearly 4 in 10, just over 1 in 3 of adults, while they make up 1 in 4 likely voters. When we look at age, we see a same see the same thing. Younger folks underrepresented by 10 points, older folks overrepresented by 15 points. Next slide. And we see these same trends or dynamics at play when we look at income and education, with less affluent and less educated Californians underrepresented, while more affluent and more educated Californians overrepresented. And given kind of the makeup by age, by income, and by education, it's not surprising that while renters make up 45% of California adults, they make up about 3 in 10 likely voters, while homeowners make up 7 in 10 likely voters. Now, these demographics are especially important regarding who goes to the poll on election day, but it's especially salient in California, where we make important policy decisions at the ballot box. How many votes are cast and by whom will impact the fate of the 10 state propositions on the ballot. And this will have major implications for policies on criminal justice, climate change, education, employment, housing, and infrastructure. Additionally, California is home to 10 congressional districts that are deemed competitive by the Cook Political Report. That's 1 in 7 of all competitive districts across the country. And so how we vote in California is going to play a role in deciding the control of Congress this November. Next slide. And so I'd really encourage you, if you have questions, to reach out to me. And I believe that Robert dropped into the chat a couple of links, one to our likely voter, Just the Facts, and another to our voter and party profile piece. And those are great because it's a large data set that we compile over the whole, basically, 7 surveys normally, and that really gives us a big sample size. I would encourage you to look at our September survey that had findings on propositions and the electoral races, as well as look out for one last survey before the election as we prepare to move forward. I would just encourage everyone to definitely get out there and vote. Check your registration. If you're not registered, it's really easy in California with the online registration. And let's definitely make a difference in the world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dean. I really appreciated that final message of yours. Fascinating statistics that you've shown us today. I'd now like to bring all of our panelists back on for a quick Q&A session. We have one question in the Q&A box, and I'll present it to the group. It reads, is education on Project 2025 partisan? For example, it calls for the elimination of Head Start, which serves a lot of folks, but it is considered a partisan platform. But is it considered a partisan platform and not actual legislation? Would anyone like to speak to that question?
I will. No surprise to anybody here. We've gotten this question or variations of this question on Project 2025 a lot. It is a partisan platform. The twist with it is that it is actually put on a C3 platform. So we're still trying to puzzle out how that has happened. But yes, if you are commenting on Project 2025, it is possible that it is a partisan activity. However, there are all sorts of issue areas that it calls out within the project. And if you happen to be an organization that works in one of those issue areas, you can certainly sort of correct the record, for lack of a better word, and put out statements that are factual and objective and correct the misinformation that is in Project 2025 without being partisan. It is a delicate line, but it can be done.
Great. Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions in our chat. If anyone has one that they would like to quickly submit, we have just a little bit of time left. Otherwise, I'll ask Vanessa to bring us to our next slide. And this is really just a thank you to all of our panelists today. This is a wonderfully well-rounded group with folks who have insights to share across the board. And I hope that this information has been useful to our participants today. I'd really like to thank Dr. Shirley Weber, California Secretary of State, for joining, Quinn Tu from Alliance for Justice and Boulder Advocacy, Dean Bonner from the Public Policy Institute of California, and also Tiffany Carter from the National Council for Nonprofits. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. We look forward to hosting you, hopefully on another upcoming event. And with that, I would like to do a quick plug for some of our upcoming educational events. The next one will be on October 22nd, and this is conducted with the California Policy Forum. And this will be about narrative essentials, effective storytelling, and issue messaging for stronger advocacy. Next slide, please. This is something that I really want to underscore and that we're very excited about. We will be hosting on November 20th our California Nonprofits Annual Policy Conference. And this is our first in-person event in several years. And we're really thrilled to be hosting at the Audrey Ermas Pavilion in Los Angeles in person. So I believe Lauren will be dropping in the registration link to this in the chat, and I will also include it in our follow-up email. And finally, thank you to all of our participants for attending today. This is such an important issue and a timely issue as we move towards the election. Just another underscore that everyone will be receiving a recording of today's webinar, including the PowerPoint, the resources that we've referenced, as well as contact information for our panelists. So thanks again for joining us. And I'll ask us to move to the last slide and we can close out. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.